You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at soxinthebasement.com. Couple things to talk about on this episode, even though it's January and it feels like the dog days of the off season when you're not actually spending big money and going after big free agents. But there's a few names out there that I would like to see this team get that are right there in the range of the type of player that they've been adding so far. It's not what I want, but if this is how we're going to spend and these are the type of players we're going to add, I still think there's a few more pieces that could be added to this team to increase competition, possibly have a player you could flip at the deadline for more prospects and continue to build. And speaking of building, CBS Fantasy Sports, who I like to go to every once in a while, Scott White's been on the show before, and we've talked about the idea of looking at that big picture from fantasy baseball and just looking at production and production projections. They put out their top 150 dynasty projections across Major League Baseball for fantasy baseball. And 3 White Sox organizational players are on there, and only one of them is on the 40-man roster. And that tells you exactly long-term who the stars of this team are, at least from those that are trying to project out performance this year and beyond. So I want to get into that as well, but let's talk about the Dick Allen bobblehead. You want to start with that, Ed?
Yeah, let's start with the Dick Allen bobblehead. I love the fact that they're going to celebrate his Sports Illustrated cover with a bobblehead. There's one sort of glaring omission and actually an opportunity there that they could have, made it like a little bit of a light up or something like that. I mean, just...
Oh, that would have been awesome. It's missing the cigarette.
It's missing the cigarette.
This is the one where
on the Sports Illustrated cover, Dick Allen is juggling baseballs. He is smoking a heater, and he's, in the dugout. I mean, it's such a, first of all, could not be a more 1970s look. But secondly, I mean, it's part of the aura of cool that they had there. And I'm not advocating that smoking is cool, but it does make you look cool. But it's not, it's not healthy for you or anything like that. So I get that there's probably some argument about the kids.
Yeah, but the whole idea is the kids, right? Right? Like, oh, we can't show the kids that people smoke cigarettes when most kids know
50 years ago.
People smoke cigarettes and they know it's bad. Like my kids. I have a 9-year-old and the other 2 were at some point little. And if they saw somebody smoking, they're like, Dad, that's bad, right? That'll kill you, right? I mean, my ex-mother-in-law, big smoker, right? They all think it's disgusting. Like they're very anti-smoking.
Yeah.
And that's what so I don't think putting the cigarette in Dick Allen's mouth is going to influence children any more than having a liquor store be the sponsor. Like on the bobblehead, you're omitting the cigarette and you have a big giant Benny's symbol there. So that's what I find funny about it. Like you cut out the historical thing with the cigarette, and you're right, it'd be cool if it lit up, like a little light up cigarette, that'd be awesome. But just having it there, just having a little heater there between his lips as he's doing the juggling on the bobblehead would be authentic to the actual picture. And again, you can't tell me that you're worried about influencing children's when it's brought to you by Benny's.
Yeah, it just, let's not have a double standard here. We are capable as parents of telling our 9-year-old in your case, a 7-year-old in my case, our teenagers that smoking is not healthy for you. It's a bad idea. It's a bad habit to get into. It's super expensive these days. And there's a million reasons why you shouldn't do it. But by the way, 50 years ago, this is what they did in the dugouts. And you can see why, there's a massive difference between, for example, the athletics of today and the athletics of 50 years ago. Because, you don't have guys puffing away on the sidelines at a football game. You don't have guys puffing away in the dugout.
No, you don't. But here's the thing. Like think about what it would look like to a kid. Let's take away the funny part of we could have it light up.
Yeah, ignore my stupidity for a second there. Yeah.
You have a stick. You have a stick in his mouth. You could make it look like a toothpick. Otherwise you just have a little white stick. That's all it is. Like he could be chewing on a straw. What's he chewing on, Dad? A straw. Move on. Like to me,
it doesn't matter.
You're going for something historical. You're going for the look of it, and you didn't hit it all the way. And that's what's silly about the bobblehead to me. Like if you're gonna go all out on it, because it's funny for us to say have it light up, but you could just make it a little white stick that's kind of hanging out of his mouth. And I don't think it would be a problem at all. And again,
not even a little bit.
A Binny symbol in which the Y is a martini. Like right there.
Right. And it's
kids, don't smoke, but get to drinking as quickly as possible. You're Southsiders.
Right, exactly. Just, let's go. Let's grab a bottle of whiskey. Right. You're close enough in age.
Right, exactly. I mean, look, it's going to be cool. I want one.
I do too.
I'm not even a bobblehead collector, and I want one. So this is like one of the rare instances where I'd be like, I want to get my hands on that, either at that game or the secondary market. And that's what this team has to do this season. If they want people to show up and go to the games, they're going to have some great giveaways. Like I think they're
get
big.
Back to the real great giveaways, the great promotions that they used to do.
Yeah, they're big days at the ballpark are going to be promotional days in which there's half price concessions, days in which there's the tickets are cheaper. They hopefully are going to keep things in place where you can move about the ballpark so I can still buy a $7 seat at the last minute and then just go find an open seat on a day where it's not that busy. I did that a couple of times last year. That's kind of how they have to operate the ballpark because they don't have a lot there this year. And it's interesting. I just looked at CBSSports.com in the fantasy section, and we've talked about this before. I love fantasy baseball. But when you look at fantasy baseball projections, it's a different way to try to project out a player. You can go and look at all the models, and I'm sure that they do. We've talked with Scott White from CBS Fantasy, who's their head guy over there for baseball before on this show. Maybe we'll have him on here in the spring as we get ready for people doing their drafts that are in the fantasy baseball because I like having him on, even though he gave me bad advice last year. He gave me bad advice. I had a pick where I could get my choice on a dynasty player. Like I have a very good team, and I was going to take Paul Skeens. And he told me Wyatt Langford long-term was going to be the best player out of those two. And in their own rankings for the top 150 dynasty players, Paul Skeens is about 20 slots ahead of Wyatt Langford this year. So now the admission is, maybe Chris was right in the first. I changed my pick because of Scott White. So I kind of have a bone to pick with him when he comes on the show.
Yeah, that's problematic.
Right? Look, you need multiple outfielders in fantasy, but you need multiple pitchers. And he talked me out of it. Like, you can go back and listen to the show from last year. He talks me out of it on the show. And then I'm like, well, he's the expert, and he came on my show. So what kind of an ass would I be if I don't go with what he's saying to do with this pick? And then I did it, and now even in these rankings, clearly he was wrong on it. So he's not perfect. But what I found that was interesting in these rankings, which really are taking into account potential for a player, they rank what he's currently doing, they rank what they think he can do in the future, and they rank it by confidence on a scale of 1 to 5 after doing all of these different projections to try to figure out if a player would be long-term somebody you'd want on your fantasy baseball team, which means that he would be performing in Major League Baseball well and at a high level long-term. These are the top 150 players. Is what they put out. And it's interesting. Luis Robert Jr. ends up 64 on the list. He's the highest ranked White Sox player. Think about that. There's 63 guys ahead of the first White Sox player that shows up on this list. So right away, you're in trouble.
Including the immortal Travis Bazzana and Lawrence Butler of the Athletics.
Yeah, they're higher than him. That's how bad Luis Robert Jr.'s season was last year. And his confidence ranking is the lowest possible. They have the least amount of confidence in him, but it's like, well, we got to put him somewhere on the list so he can sit right here.
Bo Bichette is actually listed higher than him.
And he had a bad year, too.
Bo Bichette is a guy that people are saying might be washed.
Yeah, he had a bad year, too. Both of these guys are on my fantasy baseball team, too, by the way. Both of them I thought were going to be like superstars that led my team for years and years. Last year, they were brutal. Sox in the Basement listeners, switch to a new age of life, whether it be mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, even yourself, staying out of assisted living. Make it so they can get around on their own and live independently. Hyatt Home Medical Equipment is there for you with stair lifts, ramps, grab bars, lift chairs, and even bathroom remodeling. They work with your insurance, and Hyatt has 0% financing for qualified individuals. If you use a CPAP machine and you're unhappy with your vendor, switch now. They have testing rooms with the latest and greatest in the technology there for you to try out. You can also have your supplies directly mailed to you. They have continuous glucose monitors and so much more. See everything that Hyatt Home Medical Equipment has, whether it's a long-term issue or something short-term, at hhme.com. The interesting thing on this list, and the reason I bring it up is, of these 150 players, that could be anybody from the majors to the minors because they're looking long-term at production. There are two other players from the White Sox organization on the list. So you sit there and you think to yourself, okay, well, who's valuable on the White Sox right now, right? Is Andrew Benintendi, who's making $15 million a year, valuable on the White Sox? Is Andrew Vaughn coming in at $6 million in his arbitration? The White Sox brought him back. Does somebody believe that he's going to turn around, he's going to be valuable? What about Corey Lee? He looked kind of good as a catcher. It's hard to find good catchers. Is there a pitcher that's currently up in the major leagues the White Sox have that you want to get on your team because they're going to just become just a great player? Is there something on this current team? And the answer is no. What's interesting is, from an outside looking in perspective, long-term at the White Sox, according to this list, the next two most valuable players on this franchise, ranked 101st is Noah Schultz. And then ranked towards the bottom of the list, I want to say he's in the 140s. I want to find him here as I'm scrolling down. I know Hagen Smith is on here. There he is at 136. Hagen Smith and Noah Schultz are both on this top 150 list. The belief is, and they're not specifically looking for White Sox players. They could have just put one on this list. They're just trying to find players that are valuable. I find it interesting, though, that when you look at the White Sox organization from the outside looking in, and you're not trying to project the team, like how they're going to win and lose, you're not trying to figure out when a guy is going to make it into the major leagues. You're just trying to figure out value long term. The two most valuable guys after Luis Robert Jr. are Noah Schultz and Hagen Smith, at least according to this list. Everything else on your team is not that important as these guys. They're the storyline, those two guys this year. We haven't talked about it enough. When will Noah Schultz get here, and when will Hagen Smith get here? Will they be ready? And will Brian Bannister and his group over there on the pitching side prepare them properly to become mainstays, stars, guys that could have the potential to be like, Glavine and Maddox, the guys that, like, or look at any team that's got a couple of big starters up at the top. Like, these are guys that you're counting on long-term for this team. I think they're the biggest story of this year because they're not going to break camp with the team. I would highly doubt that, but they're going to make their debuts this year, and you're going to want those debuts to be clean. You want to see them ready to go. They're going to have a couple of bumps in the road, and you don't want to see injury. This franchise looks at these two names, these two pitchers, two lefties, and these guys are the future of the Chicago White Sox.
It's interesting because they aren't talked about as much, maybe because they're not immediately here, right? They're not going to be here in spring. They're not coming north with the team. They're going to spend more time in the minors, both of them. And it's interesting because they're also very similar in terms of who they are as pitchers. Both of them are lefties. Both of them are guys that are going to, sit well with the fastball, use a curve, a breaking ball basically as their secondary pitch. I think it's Smith has a splitter and Schultz has a changeup. So maybe Schultz's changeup is a little bit better. I recall reading something about that recently. But you have these two guys and you're sitting there going, okay, well, wait, why are they on this list, but say like Kyle Teal, who was highly regarded, not on the list.
No.
And here's a guy coming from the Red Sox organization. Braden Montgomery, also not on the list. Another guy that was highly touted coming from the Red Sox organization. So even if you're thinking there's bias here, okay, those guys aren't there. Edgar Caro's not there. Colson Montgomery is not there. And it's not like shortstop is a position of bounty in and across the majors where Colson Montgomery's production, especially if he is Corey Seager 2.0.
He was on it last year. He had a bad, he didn't look good. I think that's the thing. Like, as White Sox fans, you're hoping he's going to be good. Chris Getz is hopeful he's going to be good. The organization still feels good about him. The prospects heads that'll come on this show will sit there and say, oh, he did pretty well in the last couple of weeks of the minors and he did well in the Arizona Fall League. But when you get somebody who's looking from the outside looking in that has no emotion, he's off the list, and he was on it last year.
Yeah, so it's and here's where I'm getting this too, is Scott Merkin wrote this just right after New Year's. He was talking about some of the storylines for this year, and Noah Schultz and Hagen Smith were very big on what he wanted to see happen, wanted to see where they were going to come in. The idea that you're going to have to wait on these guys a little bit is okay. The question becomes, why are they valuable to outsiders looking at this organization more so than some of the other guys that we've been talking about, that the team's been talking about? And when they get here, what does that mean? Does that mean that Noah Schultz is going to be viewed as a legitimate ace? Do we think that he's got that level of production in him? Do we think Hagen Smith is going to be, are they going to be a 1-2 punch of lefties right at the top of this lineup? That's
the way that they're projecting them. Like, that's how they that's how they map them out on this list. Like, that's what the White Sox have. The White Sox have a 1-2 punch of two guys that are possible top of the rotation guys, which is kind of, look, if that happens, and I liked what I saw out of Drew Thorpe. I mean, I'd like to see him take another step, and I thought Sean Burke looked really good. I know everybody's like Davis Martin this, Davis Martin that. Davis Martin hasn't done enough for me that I feel like he's anything more than a fourth or fifth starter on a good team. And Jonathan Cannon feels the same way to me. But you give me Drew Thorpe continuing to evolve. He'll have a stinker every once in a while, but you see him, if he's going out there 4 out of every 5 starts, and he is your 3, because these two guys come up and they reach their potential in the next year or so. And Sean Burke's sitting at 4. And you have all these other names, too. I mean, you can go through the list of guys that are down. Sox look good when it comes to pitching, which is something they didn't have the last time this team was put together. Last time this team was put together, you knew you had to go out and find pitching. That's why you went out and got Dallas Keuchel. And he was not the right guy. You complained about that when they went out and got him. You're like, you didn't get the guy you needed. You wanted to go get Wheeler. You didn't get Wheeler, so then you settled for Keuchel. And that was a disaster. And so what they're doing here this year in terms of how they're building this team, how things are going over the last year or so as they're doing their build, they're understanding their owner. This goes back to what we talked about last time. The owner is cheap. The owner has certain rules. One of those rules is he doesn't like to do long-term contracts, and he definitely doesn't like to do them with pitchers. And pitchers are at such a premium. You see the way that pitching is getting paid for just this offseason. You've got mid-level pitchers getting $15 million or more a year. Your best pitchers are getting $25 million a year. If these guys end up what they're supposed to be, they would eventually, when they got to free agency, be $25 million to $30 million a year pitchers if they actually reach what their potential is. So the idea is you can't afford that with this owner. And you're not going to be able to go out into free agency and spend the money on that. You have and what is the thing that is easier to get a hold of right now? Pitching seems to be. Teams aren't giving up hitters. It's hard to make a trade for somebody that's a really good hitter. When they're able to make a trade to bring in a position player, when they go get a Kyle Teal, that's a steal. That's something that's been hard to do. We've noticed that over the last couple of years with the White Sox. It's hard to get your hands on a hitter. So you're going to have to spend on the hitters, knowing the budget that the owner is going to give you. So you have to create pitching. So when you look at what they're doing, and then you look at these projections and these two guys being this high on this list, and you read all the scouting reports on them whenever we have anybody talk about them and talk about the White Sox pitching system down in the minors, there's a reason why they're leaning into it. And it's hard to argue that they shouldn't be leaning into it. This is how you do things with an owner like Jerry Reinsdorf and the restrictions he puts on your GM.
Well, the other thing, too, to keep in mind is one of the things Chris Getz said when he took over was that he wanted to establish the team as being run prevention oriented, right? He wanted good defense and he wants good pitchers. And so if you're going to be a pitching and defense style club, which is fine, you can compete more often by keeping runs off the board in some ways than you can by relying on hitters to put runs on the board, because hitters can be streaky. Power can be, fleeting here and there. you play in a cold weather town where, we have some weird days and weeks that happen, where it's just not conducive to hitting, and the start of the season could be a disaster. The end of the season could be a disaster from that standpoint too. There's just a lot of factors that go into it when it comes to offense. But if you've got a bunch of guys that are capable of fielding and you can pitch, then you can win ball games, 3-2, 3-1, 4-1, something like that. You don't necessarily have to sit there and say, okay, we got to put up 7 or 8 runs today because of what we're facing, in the opposition's lineup and what our pitchers tend to give up. So that's where looking at if you're watching what the White Sox become, looking at guys with low whips who are engaging in that good run prevention, even if the ERAs are a little bit bloated because, it's a little bit of a mess in the field behind them, that's what we're watching, right? We're watching to see, can they sustain that? Because if what you're doing is churning out top 3 starters over and over again as an organization, if you're constantly bringing guys up that can front a rotation, not constantly bringing up the back 2 guys, but constantly bringing up the guys that can front a rotation, one, you've got the ability to continually compete and doesn't really matter what happens with the hitters. 2, you can go and buy hitters for a lot cheaper than you can buy pitching, to your point, where a pitcher might want $35 million a year, but $35 million could be the lifetime contract of, a reasonably slightly above average, 1 or 2 WAR hitter who, isn't going to light anything on fire, but isn't going to hurt you, There's a lot that goes into the idea that if pitching is what you hang your hat on in the minor leagues, that is absolutely a good thing. Because the other thing too is you're never going to be able to get Jerry to sign a $100 million contract, and it's almost impossible to sign a pitcher for more than 2 years without spending $100 million on a contract. I mean, it's just, the White Sox are the last holdout of that.
Sox in the Basement listeners trying to make the most of your money, give a call to Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor. Located on the corner of 111th and Kedzie, but serving the Chicagoland area, Tom has a get-to-know-you approach and a do-the-right-thing attitude. He's been doing this for decades. It's all about knowing your options when you're investing and planning for your retirement. No matter what stage you are at, it costs nothing to check in with Tom. Give Tom Walsh, your Edward Jones financial advisor, a call today, 773-779-0023. Edward Jones, member SIPC. Let's talk about guys that are out there right now that would be in the wheelhouse of the way the White Sox are spending, because it's not what we wanted to have happen, but it's the way it's going. And again, you're operating like the Tampa Bay Rays now, and you have a GM that understands who his owner is, and he's got restrictions on him. Clearly, he's got restrictions on him, because otherwise he'd be out there and he'd be picking up a couple of guys, at $10 million, $15 million that he could flip, or he could use as just a fix, because you need a lot of fixes on this team. So it would be nice to have a little bit of stability. So I grabbed a couple of names. And what's interesting here, I looked at these 3 names because I believe these are all guys that had bad seasons that, if you look back at their track record, maybe projects for Ryan Fuller, maybe guys that are ready for the bounce back, and maybe at a lower value, but have value for this team if they can come to Chicago and get things going, and they're professionals. And what's interesting is they come in at a very different range when you look at Spot Track and their market value, which is an interesting tool. I think market value on Spot Track is a good way to look at the guys who are going to get signed in the early months of the offseason. There's a point where the music stops and some of these guys don't have chairs. So they may come down from that number. So, for example, I like a guy like Ty France. I think that if you look at Ty France, who can go and stand at second base, who can give you some offense, and who stood at first base most of the time over the last couple of years, and you might need another bat. We really don't know who's going to be the designated hitter on this team, and I don't know if Andrew Vaughn is going to work out. You look at a guy like Ty France, and in 2021, 2022, this guy's tearing it up. And he didn't have a bad 23 either. He at least was league average in terms of his OPS, and he was providing some pop, but not enough. And then he kind of had a fall off, a real fall off last year. He's only entering his year 30 season. It'd be curious to see whether or not they thought, here's a guy that could have a bounce back. Now, his market value, according to Spot Track, is like $12, $13 million. You're not paying that. Like Chris Getz isn't going to pull out that kind of money because Jerry Reinsdorf isn't going to give it to him. And I wouldn't give him that much because you're looking for bounce back. Like, you're not giving that money to a guy you're not sure if he's going to work out. But if you hold out long enough in the offseason, that number could come down considerably to the range of the type of guy that they may go get. Another guy that's very similar to that, Connor Joe's market value is about $8 million right now. Here's a guy who can play the outfield, can stand over at first base, is versatile, and had a couple of really nice average to above average consistent veteran seasons between Colorado and Pittsburgh over the last couple of years, and generally does really well in the first half. You want to talk about a flippable guy. Here's a guy that may come out hot. And there's a piece that if you can get him late in the offseason, you don't have to spend a lot. Now, what I found most interesting is the third guy that I just randomly picked because I was like, that's a name. And I looked at his stats and I said, okay, here's a player who in 2020 in the shortened season had a 932 OPS, in 21 had a 949 OPS. Had a rough year in 22 when he went to Seattle. We always talk about that. People go to Seattle and everything goes bad for them, right? You're in Cincinnati and you're in a bandbox. You go to Seattle, things change.
Right.
And when he's in Seattle, he's got a 688 OPS. That's not good at all. And then he kind of struggles a little bit. But he spent half the year last year, or 379 plate appearances with Washington, where he had a 793 OPS, and then came back down to earth in the time that he was with the Mets. He's going to be 31 years old, and according to SpotTrack, has a market value of about $2.5 million. I think you need another outfielder on this team. I really do. And I would love to add another bat. And I would be interested to see whether or not the White Sox would go out and grab Jesse Winker.
Oh, Winker. That's an interesting name. Because that's a guy that he really is a project. He's a guy that has always been listed as a guy with, endless potential, but has never really turned that corner into stardom.
I mean, he's had a couple of big years, but if he could have been consistent, stardom. But he could be a bounce back type guy.
Yeah, and that's Ty France is along the same way because there's a guy that the knock on Ty France was always that he can hit, but he just doesn't have that much power. And because he's a first baseman, you don't really want to put a first baseman out there that's only going to hit 18 home runs or something like that. But he's professionally only played in San Diego and Seattle, which are home run suppressing stadiums. What if he does come here and has a good solid first half, hits somewhere in the 280s, 290s, drops 15 homers over the wall, playing in much better venues for him, and, shows that someone could use him in the second half, especially if they also have a bandbox or at least a reasonably hitter-friendly stadium that isn't Seattle and isn't, the giant cavern of San Diego. But Winker's definitely one of those guys too. And I know you've got Austin Slater, who also can play the outfield and stand at first base. You've got Mike
do we
Tauchman.
really think Austin Slater? I know he was the number one guy that they were going out and get, right? Isn't he the one that sat there and said
he was their number one target?
He was told he was their number one target. But I mean, even Fangraphs has him as the guy at the end of the bench in terms of projections. And there's nothing that makes me feel like he should have a guaranteed spot on the team. And it's not like he gave him a lot of money. Like, he makes sense. Like, here's the thing. If you're a general manager and you're in these restrictions that we talk about with Jerry Reinsdorf, and you know what kind of year it's going to be, maybe it makes a lot of sense to go get an Austin Slater in case somebody doesn't fall to you. But as you get closer to spring training, and like I said, the music starts to stop, and there's free agents out there that don't have chairs, and the market value starts to move to a range where you can justify it to your cheap owner, and you're able to go get one of these names or another name that I haven't mentioned yet, Austin Slater can be pushed right off of this 26-man roster without a problem.
Oh, very easily.
Right?
Very easily.
And we're talking about a team that doesn't really have a defined designated hitter, and first base is a question mark. Even though you're spending $6 million and you might have liked the way that he kept trying last year, he's a massive question mark that isn't guaranteed. It shouldn't be guaranteed a spot, and definitely isn't guaranteed to make it through the year if he doesn't show you something other than what he's given you over the last couple of years. So, like, that's the thing. Like, you can add a bat. It doesn't even matter if it's a France who really is going to play first base, and you may spot start him at second, and I think he can play a little bit of third. He's done that before, and he might be your DH.
Second base. He's
right.
Been around.
And Winker, again, like I said, with the outfield, you got Luis Robert Jr., you got Andrew Benintendi, you got Mike Tauchman. I mean, those guys right now are your outfield, but one of them could move into designated hitter. you may end up moving one of them, and a guy like Winker may still be sitting out there waiting for a chair to sit in as the music starts to die down. That's going to be what you're going to be watching from this team. I don't think that Chris Getz is done. He probably has a list, but he's waiting for somebody to get into the range that makes sense as we wind down the offseason. I think you're going to see more pieces still added to this team. That's why I wasn't surprised by Josh Rojas, because that's the type of signing that you make when the market starts to come to you and he goes, you know what, this is a good landing spot and I need to play somewhere.
Yeah, especially a guy like Rojas who, as the chairs, like you said, are starting to be pulled away, a team like the Cubs is looking at him, but he's looking at the Cubs going, well, am I your starting third baseman, or is that going to be Matt Shaw? Am I your starting shortstop? Well, wait a minute here. You've also got Nico Horner on the infield. Where am I playing exactly?
Like, if you're one of these guys, think about it, Ed. If you're one of these guys, and like a Winker, like the names that I rattled off, or like Rojas, and you're now around 30 years old, you're very aware of the fact that may be the end of your career unless you could find a place where you can thrive and get that next contract. Where else are you going to go where you're going to have open competition in spring training as a veteran going up against rookies? And it's just like the new guys in the office, right? You know you're better than them at your job. You know more than them. You know you're smarter than them. You know you got more experience. That's why you come to a place like this, right? That's why you sit there and say, I'm going to go to the White Sox. I'm going to have a nice spring. I'm going to earn playing time. They're going to play me, and they may even move me into the pennant race by the second half, and then I'll get money, or I'll have a nice season while I'm there. And I'd rather go do that than get lost on another team. And then all of a sudden one day the music has stopped and I'm taking NRI contracts, minor league deals, and I'm a non-roster invitee to spring. You don't want to be that. And some of these names are guys that are borderline that right now. And they're definitely that next year if they don't produce in 2025 and the Sox offer that opportunity.
Yeah, and there's a million other names you can look at. Harrison Bader, Austin Hayes, if you're looking at outfielders that are in that. Other infielders, Adam Frazier still floating around. That, he's a guy that could use a bump. Brendan Rodgers was one of the Colorado Rockies guys that never quite panned out that could use it. There's a lot of hungry veterans that are like that you could sit there, and the White Sox could very well offer them these non-roster invitee minor league contracts as well. It's not to say that they're going to offer them major league contracts.
Yeah, but they could give a major league contract at a low amount of money if they wanted to, or have escalators like if you make the team, you go up, because the position that they're in is essentially everybody on this team sucks, right? Like everybody on the team sucks. There's some potential. There's a few guys that might have a bounce back. You don't want to write off the entire team. But again, we talked about it earlier, a list of 150 dynasty fantasy baseball players where you're projecting out long-term value of the players, and only one of them's on your 26-man roster. Only one of them's on your 40-man roster. And the other two are top pitching prospects. So nobody's guaranteed anything here. And so you can set up any kind of contract you want to for a guy like this. Because if you bring on value on your team, it's not only going to help with competition, it's not only going to help elevate the guys that are actually good enough to be major leaguers, it's not only going to help weed out the guys that shouldn't be here, but it might give you value that you can move, and it will help build culture on your team, which is what you need to do this year, because you're not winning a division, you're not going to the playoffs, but this is the building block right here in 2025.
Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement.
Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always on soxinthebasement.com.